This is a short style guide for the Edexcel Religious Studies A level paper, section B, questions 4A, the short 8-mark question shown here, and B, the extended question on the paper. The first thing you'll need to provide for this 8-mark question is an introduction and question wording, which will be embedded into your first paragraph. Remember that the answer is an explore answer. We're looking for the question wording of key ideas and with the general problem of suffering, and as it's 8 marks you should be spending 8 minutes. Next you will provide your first explanatory paragraph where you outline initial key ideas, and I recommend getting to a key scholar as soon as possible. I keep suggesting to aim for 4 marks, and this is because I think for the more simple questions, despite the material being tougher, you can think of the style as being similar to GCSE in terms of point scoring, in that in a paragraph like this you could develop 2 points that take some brief explanation, develop 2 of them in detail and well for 2 marks each, adding up to 4 in a paragraph, or have 4 correct statements that are detailed, that don't require as much explanation or development, but perhaps are worth about a mark each. Next you'll need to provide your second explanatory paragraph, all layer 1, so all demonstrating your knowledge, developing on the ideas in 1, depending on the question, or introducing an important divergent idea. Say, for example, you wanted to spend the first paragraph on the logical problem and the second on the evidential problem of suffering, then that would be divergent. And again, aiming for 4 marks and remembering to end with the question wording. So I aim to give you an example of this now on the next slide. Here's an example of my first paragraph then. The problem of suffering involves many key ideas. There I'm using the question wording. One of the most important is the problem that suffering presents to the traditional view of God. Sorry, that's just me doing it on my iPad. Character/nature. J.L. Mackie argued that the mere presence of suffering is enough to show that God must not be omniscient, omnipotent, and benevolent. This is because if God had the qualities of an omni-being, then he would be able to stop suffering and would want to, yet suffering exists. And I've added a section there for clarification which says that Mackie called this an inconsistent triad and used it to show that God must not exist or does not have the qualities desired by most monotheists. And this, I'm very confident, would get the first 4 marks that we're aiming for here. Now I've got a small amount of space to try and get the rest. Remember, don't write in this area here. Instead, use extra paper if you need, because then your paper will be marked by a chief examiner. If you don't use the section below the lines, because instead of using paper, definitely use paper, because when the paper's copied, it might not be sent to the examiner in its entirety. But I think that these papers are being redesigned now to have more room, so you can expect to have something like this amount in your actual paper. Anyway, I'll add my second paragraph now. Okay, here's my second paragraph. Another key idea is that the extent to suffering challenges the qualities of God. I've used the phrase key idea to link again. Some suffering is caused by man and is so horrific, for example the Holocaust, that it's difficult to understand its broader purpose. That's my first couple of points, I hope, in this paragraph. Further, some suffering is natural and raises other problems. For example, one could ask if God is responsible or even malevolent to cause an earthquake that kills, or cancer in an innocent child. This is known as the a posteriori evidential, and it should be problem of suffering, so that I have ended with the question wording. Now we can check the mark scheme to see if we think that it would score well. Difficult to see when it's there, I'll put it over here. Okay, so for 6 to 8 marks it should have a range of knowledge, specialist language and terminology. There we go, we'll move these answers. A wide range of knowledge, specialist language and terminology. I think you can see many examples of that. Knowledge and understanding addressing a broad range of key religious ideas and beliefs. So the specific theme of religious views on the qualities of God is mentioned, with themes like monotheism and omni-being. and comprehensively develops key religious ideas and beliefs to show a depth of understanding. I think by showing two versions of the problem, there's enough depth there. That's how to answer the simple AO1 question. Next, we'll look at the 20-mark question and the longest question on this paper. So this is the 20-mark question, which always begins analyse. Analyse the success of one solution, and be aware that there are other versions of this question where you're asked to look at two solutions to the problem of suffering. I think for this question it will benefit us to look at the mark scheme first. So let's have a quick look here. 5 marks AO1 and 15 marks AO2. Now, where it asks for one solution, either Augustine or Irenaeus, that is important for the structure of your answer, but it doesn't mean you exclusively only talk about one. So in this example here, I'm going to write about Augustine, but because this is heavily weighted for AO2, I need to have some criticisms or weaknesses to point out, or alternatives to discuss. So later I'm going to deliberately use Irenaeus as an alternative. And that's why in the AO2 section you see examples of both. So my essay will undoubtedly be about Augustine, but as a result Irenaeus can become a contributing scholar or an alternative divergent point of view. Now, if you look at some of the AO2 points here, when you're looking at the strengths of one solution, very often the strengths themselves are just showing you a thorough understanding of the essence of the argument. So if you look at this one, for example, what is good about the Augustinian view is that if he says evil is a privation, then it relieves God of responsibility. And if I say that in a favourable way, then I've turned it from AO1 to AO2. And that's what I'll be doing in this model answer. So we'll come back to this at the end to see how we think it's done. Okay, this will be, on this page here I'll just do style, and then after that I'll give a brief model answer. The first thing you need to provide is the AO1 introduction and question wording. Because it's a 20-mark answer, I am going to truncate the introduction, but it's going to be very, very short, as you'll see on the next example. So for 20 marks, you're going to have to try to analyse a range of features, and remember that the word analyse means break something down into its smaller parts to gain a broader understanding. A bit like talking about the engine of a car or the ink in a pen. You would learn more about its appropriateness for dealing with particular situations by looking at the particular parts that make it up, and that's what we're doing here. So what you'll be doing is looking at each feature in isolation to talk about its relevant successes, rather than giving just a snap judgment on whether or not the whole theodicy works. A recommended phrase then is that the success of this key feature is that it provides, and where possible try to think about that from a religious point of view. In order to ensure that we're meeting the AO2 requirements, I recommend in every paragraph that you consider a reply or a criticism of that feature at as many stages as possible. Now essentially you want to try to repeat this method several times, so I'm not going to write the structure out in much more detail than this for now, but you'll see an example in just a moment. That in the second paragraph you need to move on to a separate feature and consider the reply. That is a reply as a general criticism or from a scholar. And you can, of course, reply again and counter-argue from the point of view of Augustine, and then talk about however his successful defence of this is, etc. Remember to use all the other scholars you've learnt. And then my last tip is that very often when people are looking for a strength of these theodicies, one of the easy ones that they miss is that where the theodicy is supported by the Bible, it's a real strength. It's useful to religious believers if a key philosopher produces an argument that claims to be Christian and it happens, or it clearly is supported by the Bible as well. So if particular verses can be used to support the theory, then you should definitely mention that as a success. And at the end of the answer you'll provide a final paragraph which is a conclusion, but I don't want you to say in conclusion, this is a tip that I've had recently at training, which is just make it do the job of a conclusion, and then you don't need to say it. Keep it short, relatively short and simple, normally shorter than an evaluative paragraph, and use the question wording at the end, and then that way we have bookended the answer of the question wording. At the start we deliberately use it, and at the end occasionally throughout, and it's just to play it really safe in terms of showing the examiner exactly what they want to see. Okay, I'm going to try and play with the format a bit just so that I can try and fit as much of this on one page as possible. So unlike my other answers, it won't be put onto the exact exam paper, but I'm going to try to mimic the amount of room that you have. Okay, so I'll put my response under here, and you can pause it and zoom in if you need to, or do something, I'm sure, so you can see it, but I'll try and explain it to you as well. And you'll be writing your own responses anyway, so don't become too committed to this. Instead, practice, 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 and then stay fresh enough that you can produce your own. Okay, so I'm not claiming that this will be perfect, but I'm hoping that it would do well. And here is my introduction replying to the question. The problem of suffering is a classical problem, and solutions come in the form of theodicies. Leibniz coined the term, and it means a justification for the traditional view of God. One of the most successful theodicies is presented by Augustine in the 5th century. So all I've tried to do here is explain what the history is briefly, show a bit of knowledge, a couple of scholars, and start to respond to the questions. I've already introduced enough about Augustine, and I can go straight into a feature and evaluations of that feature as of now. So here's my first evaluative paragraph. One of the first successes of the Augustinian theodicy is that it's largely based on Genesis and the writings of St. Paul. So that's an opinion of mine straight away, but it's one that has to be credited. Augustine suggests that as Genesis states that God created the world and it was good, that God cannot have created evil. This is a strength as it resolves God of responsibility for the suffering in the world. Augustine, I perhaps could have clarified there that suffering comes from evil. Augustine argues that evil is a privation, absence of good, and as such it did not require a creator. This view is criticised by Schleiermacher, who states that it is a logical contradiction that an all-perfect creation could then go wrong. So I've introduced some of the jeopardy over that position there. So in this paragraph I've tried to evaluate an aspect of Augustine's theodicy whilst using Irenaeus as a contributor, but certainly not as an alternative. Augustine's theodicy develops to argue that it's human disobedience that led to the fall and created a disharmony in both nature and the relationship between humans and God. This is successful in showing believers that God did not cause suffering and that suffering is best tackled by humans desiring forgiveness through Christ and minimizing their sinful actions. This view is challenged by Irenaeus, as his theodicy states that actually God planned for human sin, as it plays a vital role in moral or soul development. And I've tried to find an area of agreement here. So I'd say that both theorists can show that there's some positives to original sin, as Irenaeus suggests that it creates a veil of soul-making, whilst Augustine, he argues that it's a happy fault, as it led to the coming of Christ, and his atonement shows God's grace. My third evaluative paragraph, and I'm trying to get as much in as possible. The success of Augustine's theodicy is that it aligns with the free will defence of later theorists, for example Swinburne. Augustine's theodicy protects God's character. This is my favourite point to try and make about Augustine whenever evaluating him, as it allows him to be all-loving but also graceful and just. He is just, as Augustine would argue, that it was fair to punish humans for the first sin. This includes later humans, as we're all that should be seminally present in Adam. D.Z. Phillips challenges this idea as he argues that it's unfair as a benevolent God would not allow an innocent child to experience, for example, cancer. Some modern biology also challenges the notion that we are biologically related to an ancestor of just 6,000 years ago. So I'm taking the Bible literally there to try and make a range of points and comments, if possible. And here's my conclusion. Not sure if it's perfect, but I mean that's how you'll feel when you do an exam. You won't be sure, so you can just do your best. One chance. And here's my example. I'm trying to show a bit of nuance here that clearly the solution will work for a certain type of religious believer and is not likely to persuade everybody else. So the Augustinian theodicy has a range of strengths to religious believers. The theodicy is, successes, that I think, to be even more careful, look, you would have this, should say successes. Why not? Let's be exact about the question worded throughout, so that's a mistake there. Valid for religious believers who seek to hold the traditional view of God who offers redemption in Christ. For others, the problem of suffering remains unresolved, as God might be judged typo as harsh by today's standards. And that's my final attempt there. And you can have a look at the mark scheme to, let's see if I can get it out, to see if you think it will work. There we go. There we go, final look at the mark scheme, if that's any good to you. Obviously you can pause the video at any point if that helps. Alright, I hope that's been useful. Good luck for your revision. Don't forget to revise for a range of questions. We hope they're similar to these, but you should expect that the material will be juggled around. Okay, best of luck. Thank you, bye.